Good day. I'm Sam Kimball of Workforce Delivery Inc. Welcome to part 2 of our series, and currently we're looking at Stephen Harper's book, Right Here, Right Now, Politics and Leadership in the Age of Disruption. And the purpose of us looking at this book is, first of all, to understand the concepts and understand some of what the former Prime Minister was saying, and then also to test whether or not some of that learning or insight might be applied or applicable in the field of labor relations and collective bargaining. Now, in our first segment, we briefly touched on some of the trends that we're seeing in the field of labor relations and collective bargaining, where it appears as though there are increased populist trends, and certainly those impacted or represented employees are often impacted right now currently by changing market conditions, rapidly changing technology, changing public policy decisions, which cause them, both the unions and the employers in that space, to confront some difficult problems together. So for us to understand what perhaps Mr. Harper might have to say in regards to governing and leading in an environment of increased populism and increased disruption is an interesting exercise, and we welcome you on this journey. This section here is predominantly a book review of the Right Here, Right Now itself, which oddly enough starts with Mr. Harper reflecting on himself watching with a number of colleagues the United States 2016 election results. Now, the result incalculable by many, but not all. The result inexplicable by most, but not all. Stephen Harper's perspective resided in the latter category of both. Donald Trump's November 8th, 2016 phenomenon propelled further reflection. For the former Prime Minister, what began as a hint or a sense of things, murky and enshrouded by the original astonishment of it all, eventually, with further reflection and hindsight, clarified into wisdom. Right Here, Right Now is about sharing perspectives, wisdom, naming what occurred, what is occurring, why it occurred and is occurring, and what is to be learned. To explain President Trump's win requires an explanation and understanding of populism. This is in contrast, as progressives within the meaning of today's politics tend to do, from vilifying the word or demonizing the concept. Prime Minister Harper seeks to peel back the layers to the onion and reveal in a dispassionate way root causes and conditions. That is what adults and leaders do. They do not name call their problems. They walk towards their problems and confront with a view to understand. Regarding populism, I find myself perplexed by the recent use of the word populism, so take pause to reflect on its meaning. If the listener does not share my confusion, kindly indulge this brief departure from the Prime Minister's book. Populism of late has been attributed as something on the radical right and or something evil. In actuality, the word itself is relatively agnostic in relation to its morality or potential placement on the political spectrum. It can be reformative. Martin Luther King and Martin Luther were populists. It can occur at different locales on the political spectrum. Both Bernie Sanders and President Trump are populists. It can attempt to be revolutionary. The Occupy movement and the Tea Party movements were populist movements. As I reflect, I begin to think populism is simply a tool, location, or environment, and like a hammer, GPS coordinate, or forest, it is on its own neither good nor evil, neither left nor right. It still comes down to the person, party, or movement at the end of the hammer, or standing at its coordinate, or surrounded by the forest, and how they choose to swing, the direction and velocity they intend to travel, or how they choose to interact with said forest. So in grounding myself in the concept of populism, I found the following excerpts useful. In popular discourse, the term populism has been conflated with other concepts like demagoguery and generally presented as something to be feared and discredited. It has often been applied to movements that are considered to be outside the political mainstream or a threat to democracy. Typically, the term is used against others, often in a pejorative sense to discredit opponents. Some of those who have repeatedly been referred to as populists in a pejorative sense have subsequently embraced the term while seeking to shed it of its negative connotations. Populism is a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. And this is a definition of populism used by Mudd and Caldwell. Populism's core consists of four distinct but interrelated concepts. 1. The existence of two homogeneous units of analysis, the people and the elite. 2. The antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite. 3. The idea of popular sovereignty. And 4. The positive valorization of the people and the denigration of the elite. This is the definition of populism used by Ben Stanley. So coming back to Harper's book, how did the President Trump election win or phenomena work? How did that occur? And Mr. Harper in part describes this as, in short, simply acknowledging that the old tools didn't work anymore. And in spite of the old tools not working anymore, both the left and the right, liberals and conservatives and progressives, they clung on to those tools. And what happened is it created segments within society that were left behind. And for example, with regard to conservatism, there's almost a dogmatic, or an often a dogmatic worship, if you will, of the unfettered and free, unregulated free market. And Mr. Harper points to the financial markets leading to the 2008 financial crisis as an example of how a lack of regulation and the free market in that instance didn't work. And regardless of the textbook theory of a free market and a market knowing what's best, many markets have perversions within it that need to, from time to time, requires government intervention. And that did not occur. So what the general population saw, who unto themselves were faced with pressures of globalization, increased trade, changing technologies, changing government policies, and from which their own outlooks were looking more and more bleak. In the meantime, they witnessed the financial sector receive massive U.S. government bailouts, only to then a year or two later see the CEOs of those companies to receive massive bonuses themselves. So this leads to naturally, first of all, lack of trust in government and business among working people, and also the sense that their needs are not being met, and that society and those that are in positions of leadership are not serving their needs. Now, the traditional parties, whether it be liberal and conservatives or Republican and Democrats in the United States and Canada, in spite of responding to those needs, clung to their old tools. And those old tools aren't working anymore. And what the result is there were no pragmatic solutions focused at serving and resolving the fears and interests of the working class. And this left a giant vacuum that was ripe for the taking by a political leader on either the right or the left to put out a fairly populist message in an attempt to reach that group of people. So moving on a little bit to some specific areas like trade, for example, the old adage was free trade was good unto itself. And both the conservatives and the liberals and the Democrats and Republicans fell into this trap. And what we see with trade is it continues to today is liberals and the elite that go to the Davos conferences are not so much concerned with trade outcomes. Rather, they seem to be more interested in dogmatic adherence to theoretical trade policies rather than outcomes. And there's a view that if free trade is good on the whole, it must be good regardless of who's left behind. And of course, that's okay unless you're one of the ones left behind. And both along the right and the left center parties, we often look to Ronald Reagan and put him on and his policies on some sort of pedestal, the persona of Reagan on a pedestal, where he was all about deregulation and opening up free markets, without understanding that that was a different time. And even his policies since, over a period of time, has been the persona of him has been widening in terms of what the reality is for how Ronald Reagan approached his regulations and approach to trade. So even our understanding of how he was is incorrect because we've just fell in love with the persona, I guess. And that goes to both the right and the left, center right and left parties, which falls into the trap of all deregulation is good, all trade is good. And that is not even an understanding of where Ronald Reagan was at. And Reagan said, I believe that if trade is not fair for all, trade is free in name only. And I will not stand by and watch American businesses fail because of unfair trading practices abroad. I will not stand by and watch American workers lose their jobs because other nations do not play by the rules. Let me not be mistaken. We are resolved to oppose any and all unfair trading practices. It is wrong for the American worker and American businessmen to continue to bear the burden imposed by those who abuse the world trading system. So Mr. Harper, being an economist by trade, understands that there is a natural deficit that occurs in many trading relationships that is necessary and healthy. From the standpoint of richer countries typically spend more than poorer countries when they're in their respective trade relationships. And that's simply because richer companies have more money to spend, and that is a natural and healthy trade deficit. Now, what's been happening, though, is countries that have little to no labor standards or environmental standards are not competing on similar footing, if you will, with regard to, for instance, Canada and the United States, and that creates an unfair trading relationship. And it's a real unfair trading relationships. Those that get left behind, those are real, and those are not theoretical situations. Jobs get lost, and we only need to look at China, who both the U.S. and Canada and other Western democracies chose to welcome China into the WTO and increase trading relationships on the belief that with that in place, the rule of law and there would be an evolutionary perspective where China's standards would naturally begin to rise to the level of Western democracies. And that's not quite the case, and currently government has actually become more centralized and interventionist and protectionist with regard to China's policies, and essentially we've created a monster. And we've resisted confronting the encroachment in favor of the dogma of all free trade is good, and now we're in a pickle. And we're well beyond the point of where simple and practical solutions may have been available, but nevertheless, that is the situation that we're faced with. And again, this sets up the scenario where populist pressures and more disruptive forces can breed and take shape in both Canada and the United States.